Welcome. I'm Dr. Sheila Segerson, veterinary behaviorist and director of community solutions at Maddie's Fund. Joining us is Devan Amundsen, principal at Animal Welfare United. Devan has over 10 years of experience working with dog owners, dogs in shelters, assistance dogs, and other working dogs. He's here to talk about coaching dog-dog interactions. After Devan's presentation, we'll take questions. Welcome, Devan. It's so great to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me, and excited to dive in here. All right. So a little bit of background about me, because I do feel like it is relevant for this conversation that we're having about dog-dog interactions. I've been training dogs professionally since 2010, and been in animal sheltering basically ever since. Started volunteering at my local shelter basically right when I started dog training. Been a certified dog training behavior consultant since 2012 through the CPDT. And then I've been recently teaching Associate of Science and Bachelor of Science courses at Bergen College since 2018. So a lot of my recent experience has been in trying to communicate all the complexities of animal sheltering to students who are interested in possibly getting into this field. So it's kind of changed a little bit of how I talk about some of these concepts. So this presentation, I'm hoping to talk about kind of big picture why we're doing dog-dog interactions in the shelter, not focus so much on like playgroups specifically. And we've had a lot of discussions today about playgroups, some great pointers about playgroups. But I want to get into kind of the bigger pieces of this and also talk about kind of the building blocks that we should be playing around with when we're considering what our dog-dog interactions look like in the shelter. And those are more than just playgroups. I have been working with assistance dogs since about 2020 through Bergen College. It's been a very cool experience. We still do assistance dog playgroups, and they do look pretty similar to playgroups that I've done in shelters as well. Right now, I work at Oakland Animal Services remotely. I was there in person for about a year and now remote, and I've got my organization, Animal Welfare United. And I also want to admit that I am not perfect. We're going to have a potentially complex conversation today, and I'm more than happy to admit when I'm wrong. If I'm wrong, we're more than happy to engage in a conversation about kind of why we're doing some of the things that we're doing, why we're doing some of the practices we're doing. More than happy to engage in that discussion with anybody. So I'm excited to continue this afterwards in the Maddie's Pet Forum discussion. So anyway, a little bit about me. So two key things we're talking about today: evaluation and talking points for you teaching others, because you are not a program at your shelter, right? You need a support system around you to be able to do the work that you're doing. You cannot do this all by yourself. So I want to give you some talking points. So when you're training up the next group of volunteers, it's going to help you in increasing the amount of walks that are happening in a day, or when you're training up that group of staff that's going to start implementing playgroups, or just kind of working through some of the really challenging interactions we have on barriers, on fences with the staff and volunteers. I want to give you some talking points there. So first question, what are we looking for when we're evaluating dogs? I wish that I had like, here's 5 things we're looking for. But ultimately, this needs to be customized to your organization and what you are doing, right? I can't give you this cheat sheet that tells you how this is going to work universally. You have to customize this to your program and your staff and your team and your dogs. But the first thing that I want to consider is, what's the purpose of this assessment, of this moment in time, or of this activity in general? Are we looking at outcome pathway planning? So are we looking at safety, right? And just because it's explainable does not mean that it's predictable, and about kind of what safety means. But that's what we might be looking for during that outcome pathway planning evaluation. So I might look at, what's the capacity of my current programs, right? What's the capacity of my adoption program? What's the capacity of my behavior program? If I've got a specialty program that's for dogs that fall into like a behavior category, what's the capacity of that? How many people can support that? How many dogs can we really support in that program? How many people can we really support in that program? Right? I can only do so much. I'm one person. I can't do everything. But a program can support way more than me. So are we looking at kind of planning what direction we're going? Do we have the capacity in this program, in our adoption program? What's our foster program looking like? What's our rescue program looking like? All of these are separate sort of potential evaluation points. Are we looking at matching this dog? We've determined, okay, we want to place this dog into an adoptive home, into a foster home, into a rescue, whatever it is. Now I'm looking at, like, how do I match that dog successfully? those might be different evaluation points, right? I might not be looking so much at kind of the big picture safety conversation. I might be looking more at the nitty gritty of like, okay, how does this dog interact with other dogs? How have we seen this dog interact with other dogs, and in what context? It's going to be really, really important for this conversation. What was the context we've seen that dog interact with other dogs? What's their history? What's their background? All that kind of stuff is going to go into this bigger matchmaking conversation. So there should probably be more than one moment in time whenever we can do that, whenever that's reasonable. Or is this for training and enrichment? I'm going to get into each one of these points individually in a second here. Is this a training or behavior modification evaluation? Am I looking at what sort of programs support that dog during kind of when they're in my care or post-care? All right. So the first point, pathway planning. Are we evaluating pathway planning? When I'm having this conversation with shelters and we're looking at like, okay, what does our pathway planning evaluation look like? That kind of preliminary stage evaluation. I'm probably looking at what safety tools are necessary to avoid harm to other people or dogs. That's part of that safety conversation. Do I need the dog to be in a muzzle when they're around other dogs? That might be appropriate for some situations and might not for others, right? This is going to depend on your program, your community, your shelter. Who's the team that surrounds you? I love this picture of our last group of Bachelor of Science students. We got them all jerseys, so they felt like that team. We're all really supportive of each other. And we all knew each other's strengths, right? Everybody in this class knew the other one's strengths and knew, okay, I've got 5 people that can talk about muzzle introductions, muzzle acclimation, exercises, but these people are really stronger at working with puppies, right? So anyway, back on point. Do I need to disclose to adopters, or do I need to make a really firm recommendation to adopters that this dog cannot be off leash with other dogs? If so, does my program support that? Right? Do we have a partnership with something like Sniff Spot, who I might be able to give them, 5 free visits to a local Sniff Spot or like 5 whatever, to get them a safe space to be off leash without other dogs around? Some of the times when we're having behavior conversations, dog-dog behavior conversations, we're asking our adopters to have an above average level of dog knowledge. And if you want your adopters to have that, that's fantastic. I would love to support programs that do that. What does that program look like? Right? How do they access those resources? Are those just available online? Are they just available in person? How much do they cost? Right? How often are they offered? What times are they offered? If I want to elevate that person to a really high skill level, what are the resources that are in my community right now that can get them there? And if they don't exist, I might not have a pathway available within my program. And that doesn't mean that I can't have that. For me, that's exciting. That means I've identified an area where I can build something out to support those dogs and support those people taking those dogs. So look at your programs. Your programs support the use of the tools listed above: a muzzle, no off leash, above average dog knowledge. Do your program support that? Does the person, when they're picking up the dog, whoever it is, if I'm off today, right, because I need breaks, because I need to complete my stress cycle, I need to not burn out. If I'm not there, is somebody else sufficiently trained to offer this person the level of knowledge that they need, the level of support that they need? And then post-placement as well. I might not be available forever, right? It can't just be me. What is in your community? Are there people in your community that are really skilled at dog-dog interactions? That's a very specific skill that not everybody specializes in. So look at that. We can say, just go hire a dog trainer, but does your local dog trainer have really strong dog-dog interaction skills and can actually successfully coach this person? I know that locally in the Bay Area, we've got really long wait lists for a lot of our veterinary behaviorists, for a lot of our high-level behavior consultants. We've got really long wait lists. It's not really reasonable to ask somebody, even if they've got the money to do it, to go hire somebody. It's just not available right now. So bigger picture problem is that we need more of these people in our community. All right, second bullet point that we might be evaluating for: outcome matching. This is something I'm really passionate about, all stemming from the first time that I was deposed about a dog who bit somebody. Allegation was that I didn't disclose what I should have disclosed. The reality was very different because I keep lots of documentation. I'm very obnoxious about my documentation, and I'm very thankful that I was at the time. But one of my big takeaways from that is that whenever possible, I want to avoid definite statements, right? I want to avoid saying this dog is dog social. Okay, there's a lot of context that surrounds that term, dog social, or this dog is dog selective. There's a lot of context there. What does that mean? And what does that mean to the adopter? I've talked to a lot of people outside of the sheltering industry who they'll ask me a question. They're like, I'm seeing this dog on a website, and it says that they're dog selective. Is that like code for them that they're not social? Like, no, it's not code for anything. Like, there's so much more context that's needed there. And when we speak in these definites, we get adopters speaking in these definite statements as well. My dog, I want a dog, I need a dog that is dog social. Okay, what does that mean? Let's extrapolate. Let's build a bigger kind of picture, more complete context here. I was going to belabor this point, but Reagan's presentation on day one about behavior dogs, how to get them out alive, she talks about defining key terms. So I'm not going to belabor this point too much. Check out that presentation. But really important that you define in writing what jargon you're using internally. If you're saying dog selective, if that's a category, define what that means. It's a really useful activity just to do for your team. But it's also a great way to communicate really transparently with adopters and say, hey, this is what we mean. When I say something like dog selective, this is what it means. Third evaluation point we might be looking for. What enrichment am I doing with this dog while they're in the shelter or in foster or post-adoption? Are we looking at training or are we looking at behavior modification? And I think it's important that we start looking at these two things slightly differently. I don't want to pull them apart too much because obviously they're part of one big picture, but I think that we can start teasing these out a little bit and saying, hey, are we talking about teaching a skill right now, like a human-related skill, like recall during play? That's a training skill. And if I throw the dog into a group of 5 other dogs with no context whatsoever for what, hey, my dog's name is Wade, he's right here. Wade, come. If I jump right into that, throw him out into a multi-dog play group, tell him to come, he's going to be like, I have no idea what you're talking about. I have no context for what you just asked, and there's all these distractions around. That's probably not a great way to teach recall. So maybe I need to look at these things outside of that context and then slowly bring them into that multi-dog context or just distance context, right? All of these sort of things are setting up an effective training scenario. They're not something I can just like throw the dog into and evaluate and say, well, the dog can't do it. Well, have I given the dog opportunity to learn how to do it? We're talking about behavior modification. This category, I have seen so few, me personally, and if your shelter can do this really, really successfully, please, I would love to see it. I love seeing this in action. But a lot of us don't have the capacity to do this in-house. This might be an area where we support our fosters in doing this. We support our foster homes or we support our adoptive homes in doing long-term behavior modification, saying, this dog is not great at reading other dogs. I need them to learn how to do that. Here's how we're going to go about doing that. And we're going to do that starting with, this specific pool of dogs out in the world. Are we talking about modifying an emotional response? There's been a lot of great conversations today about modifying that emotional response, the importance of modifying emotional responses. This can be a slow process. And ultimately, some emotions are functionally important, right? I can't teach the dog to never feel frustrated or never feel anxious or never feel scared. That's unreasonable. So what if we say, okay, I don't want you to feel scared when you see other dogs, but if you do feel scared, here's how you respond to that fear, right? What you're doing right now, this barking, lunging, thrashing, throwing yourself on the ground, screaming, that is not working. What's going to work instead? To say, hey, owner, person walking me, holding me at the end of the leash, I need to get out of here. I'm uncomfortable. We've got to give them that opportunity to learn that. And this is probably best happening outside the shelter in foster homes. Because the other important thing here is context and how that dog is generalizing. So when we look at all these different possible kind of data points, when we're looking at this dog seeing other dogs in a shelter context or post-shelter or pre-shelter, post-shelter context, what does the dog seeing another dog on leash, both dogs are on leash and they're at a long distance, what does that tell us? Well, it tells us how the dog responds to seeing the dog at a distance on leash. Does that tell us how the dog does off leash with small dogs? No. Those are two different contexts. How does the dog respond in the shelter behind a barrier? Hey, that's very different from how the dog responds to a backyard fence, potentially. Right? Those are two different contexts. And the less we can predict and the more we can just inform people, the more successful, the more we're setting ourselves up for success here. So I want us to consider when we're doing evaluations, we're taking a moment in time, and we also need to be really mindful of the context where that evaluation is happening. Even if that dog is really, really successful in play groups at the shelter, they might not be successful at the dog park. Those are two different contexts, right? We set those two situations up pretty differently most of the time. Most of the time in multi-dog interactions at the shelter, I take all resources out of the picture. Well, in a home, there are resources, and there's resources that I really can't remove, right? That sun puddle that shows up at noon, I can't remove that. Happens around my house. I've got sun puddles kind of forming all over the place. So we've got to put these into context, people, and help adopters understand the context that we're seeing all these behaviors, which we'll get to at talking points. So again, considering the context, looking at this picture of this dog, this is my personal dog. Love this picture. This is him running joyously. We had a fully fenced 20-acre, or not 20 acres, like 8 acres, that he's running around on at top speed, and he was having a blast. He had never had that much space to run. So this is just him, like his jowls are just kind of flopping up and out. If I took this out of context, you might be like, that dog might not want to interact with me, right? We've got the tail's kind of low in line with his spine. That's just kind of his natural tail carriage. We've got the whites of his eyes showing, again, because he's running and like looking at me like this. Ears are back. If I take this out of context, I might get the wrong idea of what's happening here. Really important to put these into context, put our evaluations into context when we're working with dog-dog interactions. Okay, there's our evaluation piece. Put it into context, take those data points, right? If I've got enough data points, maybe I start forming a pattern, but I need to have that pattern in context. Now it's time to do arguably the more challenging part of this, which is talking to other people about this. And this is where we start building a lot of constructs around like, okay, well, if we see this pattern, we call it this. So it's something that I'm building, right? That I, the human, am building. My first thing is I would love for everybody to get really comfortable with saying, I don't know. I love some of the Q&As. I noticed it especially with Mike Shikashio's Q&A at the start of this day. A lot of his answers started with, it depends. And the more you start talking to experts in this field, the more you start hearing a lot of, well, it depends. Depends on the context. It depends on this. It depends on that. There's a lot of factors to consider here. So I don't know if this dog will like your dog. I don't know what liking your dog looks like. There's a lot of context to consider there. So we need to get comfortable with saying, I'm not sure. And there's a second part to the sentence that I'll cover at the end. So my recommendation for starting to get comfortable with that, I don't know, and starting to have these conversations with both like internally with your team and then externally with fosters, volunteers, adopters, whatever it is. Your job is not to predict the future. Your job is to inform and be there to support. So my job is not to say, I think this dog will get along with every dog in the whole entire world. That's not fair, right? And you're probably wrong to a certain degree, right? My job is to say, hey, I've seen this dog meet 40 other dogs in their time with me, and they went to a foster home and they got along with 12 of the fosters, like rotating dogs. I haven't met a dog this dog doesn't like. Does it mean that he can't meet a dog that doesn't like? No, absolutely can meet a dog that doesn't like. My job is not to predict. My job is just to tell you what I've seen and be open to talking to you about that. Okay, so here's the eval video. I'm gonna have to mute myself so I don't talk over it, but I want us to just look at this video, take out all kind of expectations for what dog-dog interactions should look like or what you want to see. Nothing's gonna happen. Nobody's gonna get hurt. I promise. I can promise that because if you recorded video, nobody's gonna get hurt. Just watch. Take all of your expectations out of it and just watch. All right. If I take that little moment in time, that like 30 seconds, 45 seconds, and I start extrapolating that out, that's not fair to that dog, right? And that's not fair to the adopter. That's not fair to the other people that will handle this dog. That's not fair to the other dogs this dog will encounter. I can't take that piece and extrapolate it out. What I can do is I can look at this in context, right? I've got this dog who, for all I know, we're in the shelter. This could be his first time interacting with other dogs ever, right? This could be, I have seen other dogs back when I was with my litter, and that's about it, right? I don't know. Um, Most importantly, what I can do is call out what I'm seeing. So we're going to continue watching that here for a minute. What am I seeing? Out of the white dog, I'm seeing these dramatic play bows, this really loose, silly movements, mouths open. Out of the little pitty here, I'm seeing, right, running, not quite making contact. Maybe there was an opportunity to make contact there, but the dog didn't make contact. Is he making contact? I don't know. We're feeling this out. Are things getting a little bit intense? Yes, things are getting a little bit intense, a little bit too intense for my liking, but I'm not the one supervising that interaction. Now things are slowing down a little bit. I'm seeing a high, stiff kind of wagging tail that's loosening up as we're going, right? That first video was more kind of tight wagging like this. Now it's getting a little bit looser. Movement's getting a little bit looser. Maybe we're getting a little more comfortable. That's my assessment of the situation, not objectively what's happening here. But I've got to be able to talk through these moments with adopters, with fosters, with volunteers. Got to be able to talk through these in the moment and say, hey, the white dog is humping this other dog. Maybe we should be like, hey, excuse me, I don't want that. Maybe we should call this off. Maybe we should slow things down, right? Depending on your comfort level with that interaction. So we'll talk about that more in just a second here. But here's my 3 key talking points. My 3 key talking points when I'm training a new group of people, when I'm training students, when I'm training volunteers. My 3 questions are, is this dog reading the other dog's communication, right? Are they able to understand that when the white dog drops the play bow and is like throwing their body around all loose and silly like this, that means the dog might want to play or is being silly at the very least? They read that as silliness. Is the dog communicating what they want? Is the dog communicating, hey, I'm not comfortable right now, or hey, I really want to play right now, or hey, I don't really like how this play is going, or hey, this is mine. Hey, I don't want you to come close to me. Are they communicating? If they are, fantastic. My job is potentially to support that communication and continue to develop that dog's skills and ability to communicate what they want and ability, hopefully, to de-escalate conflict. We'll talk about it in a second as well. So are they reading? Are they communicating? And are they benefiting from this interaction? Right. I originally, when I wrote the presentation the first time, I said, is the dog enjoying the interaction? I want to open that up a little bit and say, is the dog benefiting from this interaction? Because while that initial interaction might be a little bit overwhelming, right? While I might not enjoy every interaction, I might be learning something in that interaction. So like in Ferdy and Bobby's presentation, I forgot the big hound's name. Was that big hound enjoying that first interaction? Maybe not. Was he enjoying the later interactions? Absolutely. Well, it looks like he was enjoying those later interactions. But was he benefiting from those early interactions? Probably, right? He's getting some context. He's learning about what's going on. So I want to look at, is this dog benefiting from this interaction, or is this just too stressful, too overwhelming, and this dog is just learning that this whole context is terrifying? If that's the answer, I don't care how well they're communicating or how well they're reading other dogs. I need to shut that down, right? The answer to all 3 of these needs to be yes. And if it's not yes, how can I modify it? So once we can observe dog-dog communication, and once we can answer these questions, is this dog reading the other dog's communication? I say this to students all the time. We're watching 2 dogs interact. Is dog A reading dog B? Students like, yeah, right. This one bared his teeth and this one walked away. Great. Are both dogs communicating what they want? Yeah, this one keeps dropping play bows at a distance and this one keeps walking away. Great. Right. We're communicating what we want. We're reading each other. And are they both benefiting from this? Well, the one that is baring his teeth a whole bunch doesn't seem to be enjoying this whole interaction and doesn't seem to like this dog in particular. Great. This dog's not benefiting from this. Let's take him out. Let's find something else for him to do. So once we can answer those questions, we get into the really fun part of this. That's the foundational piece. Now, the fun part is, how can I, as the handler, support the development of some of these skills, of being able to read dog body language, dog reading dog body language? How can I support the development of this dog being able to communicate, the skill of communication, of communicating what they want and what they don't want, right? So some examples here. Those dog-dog skills might be, the dog-centric dog-dog skills might be asking to start, stop, or change the play style that's going on right now. Start, stop, or change the interaction altogether. De-escalating conflict is going to be a really tricky one to navigate, right? It's going to be a really tricky situation to set up a training plan that teaches that dog how to de-escalate conflict. That's going to be really tricky. That's exciting. I get excited about coming up with that training plan. I'd love to sit down with you and do that. But that is quite the training plan to come up with, right? Go back to our programs. Do our programs support us designing this behavior modification plan? And does it support us following through and implementing this? Probably not in shelter, right? This is going to have to continue at least the adoptive home, ideally from the foster to the adopter. But these skills can be incredibly difficult to learn. And we're doing the dogs a disservice if we pretend like I'm going to go in there and I'm going to do this right now in 5 minutes. Like, well, all right, I'd love to see it, right? What's your plan? Go into it. Can we talk about kind of the bigger picture plan here? What else might the dog be learning, right? Is the dog going to benefit from this interaction as a whole? So if we're working on developing these skills, we want to come up with a holistic training plan here and then ask ourselves, or before we do that, ask ourselves, does our program currently support the development and implementation of that plan? And if it does, where? Now, I do want to delineate here the human-centric skills because I've seen these get conflated a lot, especially like when I'm working with private clients. They'll be like, well, the dog, she just doesn't listen to me when there's other dogs around. We see this a lot with assistance dogs, actually, is that we get these play groups going and the dogs are like, that's the most fun thing I've ever done. This person is super boring. Right? We haven't taught the dog that the human is really valuable. We haven't taught the dog that the human is more valuable in that situation than playing with other dogs. So you have to go back and say, okay, human, if you're going to introduce this piece as part of this dog's life, I need the opposite side of that as well. I need them to not think that this is the only fun thing that happens. Right? So building that attention on the handler around other dogs is a training process, which means that I want to be deliberate in how I do it. I want to slowly build. I don't want to flood the dog. I don't want to just throw this dog in kind of over their heads. I want to have a progressive plan, like I would design any training plan. So some examples of dog-dog social skills. If I identify deficits in any of these categories, it's just a skill deficit. It's nothing to be scared of. This dog doesn't know how to de-escalate conflict. Okay, can we teach the dog how to de-escalate conflict? It's not a rhetorical question. I'm literally asking your program, can we? Do we have the resources to do it? And if not, let's make note of that. Because if we see enough of a pattern here, I probably want to have some program that supports that, right? I want to develop a team of fosters that's specifically there to teach dogs how to de-escalate dog-dog conflict, which is going to be probably one of the harder skills here to navigate and find people to do. Okay, I have to talk about use of tools because we're always talking about tools when we're talking about dog-dog interactions in the shelter. I don't know, can't pretend like we're not having this conversation, right? So I want to be clear, when we're talking about tools, we're talking about leashes, we're talking about space. What physical space do we have available to us? That's a tool that some shelters might have a lot there, or some organizations might have a lot there. Some fosters might have a lot of space that they can kind of run different zones around their house, and others might not. Right? Space is one of those things I need to consider. Okay, can I use space in my training setup, right? I've identified I need to make a training plan. It's going to teach this dog this skill or strengthen this skill because it's benefiting the dog in some way. Great, I need space as part of that plan. Okay, well, that foster is living in an apartment, like a second-story apartment, one-bedroom apartment, probably doesn't have the space to do this. This foster has a little bit of a backyard, so maybe we can set some up over there. Likewise, in the shelter, I don't think I have yet to interact with any shelter that's like we have all of the space we could ever imagine, and we never run out of space for anything, and we're using all of our space for what it's intended to be used for, right? That's not the world that we live in. So what space do I have, and how can I make that work for my program? Might not be ideal all the time. Been in plenty of contexts where it's like, hey, this would be ideal. But the reality is that to get this dog out of here, I'm gonna need to go slightly left of ideal, right? I'm gonna need to go just slightly off center from what I would ideally want to do here. Because we're an animal shelter. That's a lot of what we do, right? It'd be ideal if this person could keep the dog, but they can't because life happens and they can't. So I'm here. I am not ideal at all for this dog. The shelter is not ideal for this dog. A foster would be ideal, but I don't have a foster right now. I got to make do with what I've got and make the best thing possible for this dog in front of me. So when we start talking about the tools that I know that everybody was thinking of when I first said tools, and when you look at this slide and you look at the picture of me, you're thinking about those punishers and those interrupters. And I want to be clear to separate those two out, because I often hear people talking about the two of them as if they're one and the same. And I want to make sure that we're clear how we're using them, because I can use any tool inappropriately, right? I need to be clear as to why I'm doing, what's the function of that tool? How is that tool functioning? So quick delineation here, punishment decreases the frequency of behavior. We're talking about operant punishment, decreases the frequency of behavior. The learner, the dog, in this case, the learner thinks, I don't like that, and I want to avoid that in the future. That would be a punisher. And multiple people today, fantastic presentations, have talked about the risks of punishment, and we need to be really mindful of that risk. If we're saying I'm including a punisher as part of this training process, I need to be really mindful of what risk I'm walking into there. Kind of on the opposite side of that, am I just interrupting? A lot of the times when I'm supervising, coaching dog-dog interactions, I'm not punishing anything. I'm just interrupting. And you'll hear me say these like ridiculous things out in playgroup all the time, or like just in dog-dog interactions in general, or dog interactions in general. One that you hear all the time is like, ladies and gentlemen, what are we doing? Right? Is that punishing? To certain dogs, it might be, right? I want to not use a loud, sharp voice around certain dogs that might perceive it as punishing, because I don't want to be punishing in that moment. But if I'm just interrupting, you're like, excuse me, hello, what is happening here? I was like, I don't know. Okay, great. Let's move away from each other, right? I'm following that up with instruction. Excuse me, what's happening here? Yeah, let's back up. Let's move away. All right, let's get some space. This one's asking for space. Can we back up a little bit? Very different, very different. And I want us to be really clear when we're communicating with our fosters, with our volunteers, with our adopters. What is the intention here? Are you saying that you are going to teach this dog, you are going to tell this dog, this is scary, or you don't like this? Okay, what's the fallout? What's the potential fallout around that? Do we have other options available to us that are lower risk? Or is what you're doing just interrupting the situation? Because if you're constantly interrupting, that's also going to become a problem, right? It could eventually become annoying to constantly be like, hey, knock it off. Hey, please stop. Hey, that's enough. We want to differentiate between these two things. So when we're looking at the tools that we have available to us, space, fences, leashes, interrupters, punishers, especially, we want to look at how is that tool being used, right? Is that lining up with the intention of the tool being used? So I'm intending for the fence to just kind of safely contain this and be neutral. These 5 dogs don't perceive that fence as neutral. Okay, that's a problem. We need a different space, right? We need different tools available to us. I want to dive into why we're doing this. Why do you have dog-dog interactions, or what are the dog-dog interactions that are currently happening in your program? What are they doing? Right? What is the function of those interactions? Because our overall goal is not to predict what I think is going to happen in the future. My goal is just to inform you, the adopter, the foster, the volunteer. My goal is just to inform you of what I've noticed and be willing to support you in that. So the rest of that sentence is, I don't know. How's this dog going to do with my dog? I don't know. But here's how I can support you. I've got some baby gates that you can use, so we can set up different zones of the house and kind of slowly get used to each other. Maybe I don't have baby gates. I've got some leashes that your dog can drag around. We can do an introduction here at the shelter. We can do an on-leash introduction at the shelter. We can do an off-leash introduction at the shelter. How do we set your dog up for success? I don't know how this is going to go. I've got lots of tools available to me. And I'm not talking about physical tools, I'm talking about metaphorical tools, right? I've got lots of ways that we can go about this. How can I support you? My job is to be here to counsel you, to support you. My job is not to make all these decisions for you, because that's how we get into that really pervasive idea of like owner compliance is the biggest problem in dog training. Okay, if you've got a massive problem with owner compliance, owners just won't do what I say. Let's look at what we're recommending and look at whether or not that is reasonable for people, or am I customizing that for that person in front of me? Because if you told me, like, I want you to run 5 zones in your house to make these dogs successful, I'd be like, yeah, I logistically can't make that work. Not with the setup that I have. Right? So is my compliance with that a problem? No, the recommendation might need to be examined there. And I just want to reference Lindsay Leondecker's presentation on day 1, Don't Shut the Front Door, talking about customer service. This is the same idea that we're talking about here. We've got to incorporate those pieces into our dog training practice and into our adoption counseling practice and into our foster support practices. That customer service piece has to come in because we have to make programs that work for the person, the dog in front of us. Thank you so much to everybody that showed up for this, and thank you for sticking around for my presentation. I think we've got time for question and answer, and then I will be in Maddie's pet forum answering questions for the rest of the day as well.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Devan. We'll get to questions. The first of which is actually a comment, but it got lots of upvotes, so I will add it. Related to talking about it's okay to don't know that we don't know the answer. Someone comments, like when people ask me about a dog for adoption, I've posted, they say, does he get along with kids? And this person's response is, how am I supposed to know? Sometimes I ask if the kid is dog friendly.
Right. I would kind of put on your customer service hat in that moment. Like, how would I know? Let's change that to, here's how I can support you in finding out safely, right? But I mean, I think that's the conversation that we should absolutely be getting comfortable with, even on social media, which is a really, really hard space to have that discussion. Totally admit that. But somebody says, hey, is this dog good with kids? I'm not sure, right? What are the other variables here? When we meet the kid, do you want to meet the dog first without the kid? And then we can look at that. What are your expectations around the interactions between the dog and the kid? Do you expect the dog to be sleeping in the kid's bed, unsupervised? Right? Do you expect the dog to be running in an opposite zone of the house from the kid because you have a 2-year-old that gets into everything and it's going to want to pull in the dog's ears, and you know that that's not going to, okay, 2 very different contexts to consider here. So we've got to just be open to that conversation in the moment, even though I know it can be really frustrating. Customer service can be really frustrating sometimes. Totally been there. But that's part of this work.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, with group play, like over 4 to 5 dogs, I have noticed that dogs who are reactive towards other dogs due to fear usually behave themselves. But it basically seems like they have shut down in a way because of the high risk of danger they perceive, because they won't only have to defend themselves from one dog, but multiple. I was really happy to see this question because I see that a lot. And then goes on to say, I have also noticed that in anxious dogs going from multiple dog homes to single dog homes or homes with only 2 dogs. This makes me question the pros and cons of group play and wondering about your thoughts of this.
Yeah, I think I would go back to those 3 questions, right? Is this dog reading communication effectively? Are they communicating effectively? And are they benefiting from this interaction? Because it sounds like that dog that is shutting down in those larger settings is not really benefiting from this interaction, maybe the exposure to other dogs, but are they learning effective communication skills? Probably not. Are they learning to read dogs effectively in a context where it actually is relevant, which is in the home? Probably not. So can I set this context up a little bit differently for the dog on like a behavior modification strategy level? Can I set the context up a little bit so the dog is actually learning something and benefiting from this interaction versus just being around a bunch of other dogs, which We could be learning all kinds of things from around other dogs. We could be learning that the dogs are kind of scary. We could be learning that other dogs are really exciting. We could be learning that other dogs don't do anything. Right? Those are very different things that you're learning. And I want to set up my environment to be mindful of what I want the dog to be learning. If that answers I hope that answered the question.
Yes, it did. Thank you. Next question is, some shelters have a practice of dog-to-dog testing for every dog that comes into the shelter, and some shelters do not. What are your thoughts on this practice? Is this beneficial or harmful? I've experienced environments where dogs never get tested at shelters and then never directly interact with other dogs at the shelter, so little info is known about them regarding other dogs.
Safety, that's that pathway planning conversation, right? About safety. If I don't know at all what this dog's going to do around other dogs, what am I telling that adopter? Am I saying, well, because I've seen nothing, the dog is fine? Probably not. Am I saying, I have no idea what this dog thinks about other dogs? Here's how I can support you in finding out, right? Am I recommending, like, I haven't been able to do dog-dog introduction, so I recommend you do this slowly and with a professional oversight? Again, looking back at what resources are available, do you have trainers that can do that with the person? And then are you comfortable with supporting when the answer is no? No, we tried multiple introductions with multiple dogs in multiple contexts, and they've all gone really, really south. And if the muzzle wasn't there, somebody would have gotten hurt. Then we're having a euthanasia conversation. We're having a, can I safely support this dog given the resources that surround this dog? Which is a fair and incredibly difficult conversation to have, especially when I'm having it with a adopter who's connected to this dog. So I guess I don't want to take a hard stance on, like, we should be evaluating every single dog or we should not be evaluating every single dog or whatever it is, because it's going to depend on your program and what your capacity is and how you are talking about this.
Thank you. Next question is, during dog-to-dog interactions, do you recommend collars off or leashes during play?
Context, right? When I've done play groups with assistance dogs, we've done no collars or anything. A lot of those dogs were playing a lot around the neck, like they want to do a lot of, biting around the neck or mouthing around the neck. And so there was a lot of concern there about that. In other contexts where I've got dogs that are not really playing like super high contact, maybe it's more appropriate to have the collars as a safety tool. But again, it's going to be your context. Those collars can be a safety concern kind of in either direction, right? I can get my hands caught if I'm grabbing collars and like getting my fingers caught in there. That can be a safety risk for me. There can be a safety risk of, like, okay, how am I going to break up this fight, right? If there is some level of conflict, do I have boards that I can insert between the dogs? Do I have fences? Do I have slip leashes? Do I have something that I'm going to use to physically remove the dog? If so, and the risks of the collar outweigh the risks of the other tool, then I might go with the other tool versus the collar. I think I said that backwards, but essentially looking at the context where I'm asking that question is really, really important.
Thank you. Next one is, can you elaborate on the use of punishment during dog-dog interactions? Some animal welfare orgs will use things like prong collars and shock collars for corrections during play groups. Is using tools that are known to cause pain and fear ever justified?
Oof. Are they ever justified? So again, context where this is happening, right? If I'm putting a tool that I know is going to cause, or it has a high risk, right? I don't want to predict, I just want to inform. So I know that this has a high risk going into it of developing really negative associations with the things around this tool, right? If I'm using an e-collar or a prong collar that is intended to create some sort of sensation that the dog wants to avoid, is there a risk there of that dog learning something else that I don't necessarily want? And if so, am I comfortable accepting that level of risk? And and not just me and all the people that interact with this dog in the future, are they also comfortable assuming that level of risk? So I think more than saying like there's no possible use for these tools, I think the better conversation would be, do we understand the risks of using some of these tools? And are we comfortable talking about those risks with the people that were ultimately having care for these dogs.
Thank you, Devin. That's was a very difficult question to answer, and the risk of trauma from using punishment is a very real thing. So thank you. Next question. There was a comment from someone about kid testing at the shelter, and then someone asked, how do you kid test? And then comments about how to do it. What are your thoughts about kid testing in shelters?
Kid testing in shelters. I have yet to have any parents drop off their kids to be tested around dogs. And I know that we know from research that using a fake, a fake kid is not going to give me a super reliable result. And again, I'm continuing to harp on the context of this. This is really, really important. Is where How is this dog expected to be successful around this kid? And what am I doing to support success around that kid? So if this dog has a bunch of negative experience around children and possibly trauma surrounding children interactions, I'm probably going to say, hey, look, there's going to be a lot of work to go through here to get this dog to a point where they will tolerate the presence of a kid. Are you, adopter, comfortable with that and also comfortable assuming that level of risk? And then also on the back end of that, right? Admin, insurance, are you comfortable assuming that level of risk if something does happen? Which the answer to them is probably no. But how am I setting that situation up? Am I handing the leash off to am I letting the dog off leash around a 5-year-old being like, I don't know, figure that out? Or am I setting up a training scenario where the dog's at a 25-foot distance from the kid? We give the dog some reward to teach the dog that kids are kind of cool. They predict rewards. Am I exposing the dog to the kid 5-10 times over the course of a week? And wanting the dog to just be neutral about the kid because the kid is kind of shy and kind of just wants to hang back from the dog. And I just want the dog to keep their distance. And we're going to have baby gates in the house. Like, what's the context here? And what's my end goal? And that's going to inform how I assess, because that assessment is just a training process that I'm going through. Desensitization, counter conditioning, and habituation to that kid.
Thank you. I really appreciate this. And as you stated at the beginning, we know that using dolls and things like that aren't accurate predictors of children's behavior. And I feel like the other really, really important thing is my child is very different than Amber's child, is very different than Kelly's child. And so the original home may have had the most well-mannered child that was very respectful. My child was unfortunately not like he is now, but he was not like that when he was young. And so if I had used that good with children in that original home, I might have been in big trouble. So there's just so much that goes into this. And I appreciate you talking about it, Devin.
It's a really difficult conversation. And it's one that we don't, I wish that I could present, here's some tools that you can put in place that make you not have to have that conversation at all. But that's not the reality that we're in. We're in the early stages of figuring out what's going to work here. How do we match dogs to people? Given that I can't know how this dog's going to be with kids, how do I match them appropriately? All those things are super exciting things for us to explore and figure out. But I wish I was presenting a definitive answer, but I think that we're still a little ways out from that.
Yes, for sure. All right. Next question is, an adopter is looking for a second dog and brought their first dog to the shelter to meet the prospective dog. Their meet and greet went well. Is that good enough given that this is in a different context than home?
Is it good enough? Can I walk away from that whole interaction and be like, they love each other now? Absolutely not, right? The example that I always use, that you're welcome to steal, when I'm talking to adopters and we're doing a dog introduction at the shelter, whether that's off leash, on leash, at a distance, whatever it is, I'm usually like, hi, I'm really cool. You met me 15 minutes ago. You've been interacting with me a little bit. I seem pretty cool, right? I'm going to come live with you for the rest of our lives. And we're going to share, I'm going to go into your fridge and share your food. And I'm going to share attention. And we're just going to do everything together. That's going to go real south real quick, right? I've got to set that up for success. I've got to go slow, give the dogs their individual spaces, and encourage them to slowly get to know each other and not expect them to just hi, dog, you're my new best friend, right? That's not reasonable. And if that does happen, we might have kind of the like little kid example of like, hi, this is my new best friend I met at the park 5 minutes ago. We are immediately best friends. And 10 minutes later, it's like, I never want to see that person again. That kid is the worst, right? Sometimes a lot of really big feelings can kind of go either direction there. So really important to give adopters the context of like, yes, this interaction went great. I'm so happy that it went great. I hope this means that this will continue, but that doesn't alleviate the responsibility of us setting this dog up for success in the home and managing this interaction in the home.
Thank you. And I would also add to that that there's research that from the ASPCA that found that requiring dog-to-dog introductions did not impact satisfaction with the dog or the likelihood of success in the home. So while there are times that I do require introductions, if either the adopter's dog is a dog who needs a little support or the dog that we're sending home needs some support, those are times where I personally require meet and greets, but there is research on this topic. Last question. Do you have a specific database of resources you give to clients and adopters?
I do not, because I work with kind of shelters and organizations all over the place, and with different goals in mind. That database has got to be really custom to your organization. I would say Maddie's Pet Forum, there's the library on there that's full of tons of resources. If you're missing something, search there first and see if somebody else has already made it. But your resources for your shelter, your database should be custom to you and how you talk about dog behavior. Right? Because if you've got all these key terms that you use and they're different from this resource, someone's going to look at that and say, well, who's wrong? It's not that anybody's wrong. We're just using different language, but it's going to be confusing to a potential adopter who may or may not have a lot of dog experience. So I would say your resources need to be custom to you, but there are so many existing resources out there. Maddie's Fund's a fantastic place to start looking for some of those resources if you're lacking them. And then your local trainers have got to be included in that list of resources. You've got to know your local trainers.
Wonderful. Thank you, Devan. We're at time. Thank you so much for sharing your work with us.
Thank you so much.